So we're recording. My name's John McGavick. I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, and Dene and Dakota communities, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. It's my honor to invite Ulrike Thurm to present to us today on diabetes and exercise and focus on therapy adjustments. Over to you, Ulrike. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the nice introduction, and for all of you who can, I cannot see you all, but you can hear me. I'm, as you hear, not a native English-speaking person. So if by fault I should swear to you or say anything which is totally nonsense, please let me know. That might definitely then be a language problem, and I'd be very grateful if you let me know, and we can talk about this. And so if you have questions in between, I'm very pleased to discuss things with you. So who am I? I'm like John told you, I'm a certified diabetes educator. I'm a personal coach, and I'm a book author. The book titles are all in German, so what you can see on the right, on the top of the right, it is about it's called Diabetes and Sportfibel. It means diabetes and exercise book. It's about 500 pages, and so this is what I wrote together with my co-author. He's a scientist, he's a doctor, and he's a type 1 diabetic himself. And this is where I gained my own personal experience. I'm a type 1 diabetic since 1985. I'm using a pump since 86. I'm on CGM since 2002, 2004 on regular basis. And I'm using a DIY loop since 2017. I'm a scuba diver, I'm a marathon runner, I'm a soccer player, and I studied sports, and I'm doing a lot of things, and exercise is very important part in my life. So for me, it was always very important to get my diabetes control right, so I can do all the exercise I want to do in the way it should be. So what we're talking about is exercise. Exercise means that our muscles are working. And so it's not only the exercise you do at school, it's also the exercise you do in everyday life, meaning a relocation or doing, if it's allowed again, shopping and sightseeing tours where you walk all day. And the muscle doesn't care if he burns the energy while jogging or while doing a shopping tour. So most of the time, we diabetics think about therapy adjustments when we plan exercise. So meaning we're changing our clothes and we put on our jogging shoes, and then we think about, oh yes, there was something to have in mind, that we do something with our diabetes therapy. But if we do just like the all day usual activities, we sometimes forget that they require therapy adjustments the same way as exercise activities like sports are doing. So when I'm talking about exercise and sports and therapy adjustments, I'm also talking about gardening, houseworking, shopping, sightseeing, and all these things. So what do you have in mind before you, as a person with a type 1 diabetes, can start exercising safely? So, first of all, you have to reduce the active insulin, meaning you have to think about which type and which amount of my insulin is active at the time I want to do my physical activity. And this should be reduced by 20 to 80%, depending on different factors we're discussing later. So also you can increase the amount of carbs you're eating or drinking. It should be about every 10 to 15 minutes, about 10 to 20 grams. So this has nothing to do with diabetes. This is the recommendation of the Sports Association, also for athletes who don't have diabetes. So if this is the normal recommendation, it's just they count for us as athletes with a type 1 diabetes in the same way as for athletes having no diabetes. And most of the athletes choose a combination of reduction of the insulin dose and increasing the amount of carbohydrates. And the most important fact is check your glucose levels, and I assume that you're all wearing a CGM. Check your glucose trends. So first of all, what are the general bases? So you have to check your health requirement for exercise. So if you haven't done exercise for quite a while and you have your diabetes for a couple of years, you should have an exercise ECG to make sure that your metabolism is on the safe side. And the most important factor when you're looking for exercising safely is avoiding hypoglycemia during and after exercise. To do this safely, you have to take some special security steps, meaning you should start your glucose levels. Oh, now one of you have to talk to me. Are you using in Canada milligram or millimole levels?
Millimole.
Millimole. Okay, thank you very much. So you should start exercising with elevated glucose between 8 or 10 millimoles, and you should always have extra carbs with you, meaning with you, close with you. For example, if you're playing soccer and you're on the field and your extra carbs are locked in your locker, they won't help when you need the extra glucose on the field. So make sure that you easily can get and reach it when you need it. And look for different hypo symptoms during exercise. If your regular hypo symptoms might be sweating and you go swimming, you will not detect any kind of sweating. So you have to watch your body very carefully and closely what kind of symptoms your body is giving to you when your glucose levels are going low. For example, a triathlete once told me that when he's on his bike and he's noticing that his average speed drops below 30 kilometers, he knows that he's going low. So watch your body and watch for the symptoms, and they might be different hypo symptoms than compared to situations where you do not exercise. And if you if you did a lot of therapy adjustments and you still experience a hypo during exercise, you have to search for the cause, and therefore it might be helpful if you discuss this topic with your diabetes team, because sometimes it's very helpful if 4 eyes look on the CGM curves and not only 2. So after the exercise, we discuss that later, watch for the muscle refilling effect, but this topic we'll discuss at the end of this talk. So avoiding ketoacidosis during exercise is the second most important factor, and the hypo is more common as a risk factor when people think about diabetes and exercise. But the ketoacidosis is also as dangerous or even more dangerous than getting a hypo while exercising. So if your glucose is above 14 before or during exercise, you should do a blood ketone test. If your blood ketone test is above 0.6 millimole, you should not start or continue with exercising. So the height of your blood glucose, the blood glucose level, is not the important factor. If you ask yourself the question, can I start with the exercise or not? It's depending on the height of your blood ketone test. And so if you're now safely set, you want to start the exercise, there are some factors which should be considered before starting with the exercise, depending on your individual therapy adjustments. So the basic principle is think like a pancreas. A non-diabetic, when he starts with exercising, he has not to reduce or increase a lot of things because his metabolism is doing the whole regulation processes by itself. And if they have the most common factors in mind, that they increase the carbs, the extra sport carbs they need, everything will be fine because their pancreas is reducing the amount of insulin by itself. So if this is the best physiological principle, so for us, as athletes with a type 1 diabetes, our principle should be copy what a healthy pancreas is doing with our therapy adjustments. That means we have to consider the factors which are involved. First of all, type, duration, and intensity of exercise, meaning the higher these factors are, the more your glucose will drop. But how will you know before the game how strong the other team will be, how good your opponent is, how long the game will last? For example, if you're playing tennis, you can have a match lasting for an hour and a half, but also it can reach up to a marathon match of 4 or 5 hours. And you have to know how good your teammates will be. And these athletes you see now, they are professional athletes. It's a professional soccer player and a professional hockey player for the German national team, joining now the Olympics and the European challenges for the national teams. Their names are Timur and Sandra, and these two also have a type 1 diabetes, and they will go to Olympia and hopefully get a medal there with their teams. So here is an example of Felix. He's a professional soccer player, and he was doing his master at the Stanford University. And so he had usually 3 training sessions a day, And the more intense the training was, the higher his glucose levels were. So you can see this would be a height between 8 and 11, because this is a very intense training. And this is a much higher starting glucose than here. This is about 6 to 9. So this is a middle intensity. And also, the more intense the training is, the higher the amount of extra carbs have to be. With the middle intensity, he's taking 1 to 2 portions, so 10 to 20 grams of carbs every 30 minutes. With the extreme intense training, he takes 20 to 40 grams of carbs every 30 minutes. So the aim is, the higher the intensity, the higher the starting glucose should be, and the higher the intensity, the more extra carbs you should take. But if, for example, you want to lose weight with the help of exercise, you do not want to increase the amount of carbs extremely. So here, Katrin, she wants to lose weight by increasing her steps with the help of her pedometer. And she does not want to take much more carbs for that, because that would interfere with her aim to lose weight. So she's reducing the amount of insulin much stronger for a higher percentage. So if you want to lose weight with your exercise, you should reduce the amount of insulin more stronger, so you don't have to take up so much more carbohydrates. So type and amount of injected insulin is a very important factor, meaning the more active insulin you have on board at the time of your physical activity, the stronger the drop in blood glucose will be, meaning you have to know how long is the insulin action of my individual insulin, and what time of the day will I do the exercise, which insulin will be active at that time. So always try to reduce the amount of active insulin. And how can you do this? Felicitas describes this with 2 typical winter activities. The first was a very intense walk through deep snow, an hour after her breakfast bolus, and she was carrying her little son on her back. And therefore, because it was a very high intensity activity, she was reducing her breakfast bolus by 50 to 80%. When, for example, she was doing a mild activity, like a mild sledding activity, about 1.5 hours after her lunch bolus, she was reducing the lunch bolus only by 20 to 30% to do the exercise safely. So the aim is, the shorter the time between bolus and activity, the more intense the activity will be, the greater the reduction of the meal bolus before the activity should be, to avoid hypoglycemia during exercising. Type and amount of carbs is also a very important factor, meaning carbs with a high fiber content will elevate the glucose in the long term. Fast absorbing carbs elevate the glucose quickly, but will not stabilize the glucose level on a continuous basis. And the most important factor is the body cannot absorb solid carbs during activity. Why is that so? Because if you need more glucose and more oxygen in your working muscle, the transporter for glucose and oxygen is your blood. So the blood flow is more intense in your working muscles. So then if on the one hand you have more blood, there must be some places where you have little or almost no blood flow. And this is your das gestational, Katharina, Verdauungstrakt. Wie heißt das auf Englisch?
GI tract? That probably makes sense. Your digestion.
Okay, the part where you digest your stomach and all these things. Thank you. There will not be any blood flow, so there will be no digestion or only very little digestion while you're exercising. So if you're eating solid carbs like energy bars during exercise, they will remain in your stomach like a heavy stone, and the glucose will be resorbed when you're standing under the shower after you finished exercising. So the solution is eat solid carbs an hour or 2 hours before you start with the exercise, and drink fluid carbs directly before and during the activity. If you're doing some ultra activities like marathon running or triathlons, for sure you can also do a combination of carbs with a high fiber content and fast-acting carbs. But if you do just exercise for a normal duration of half an hour or an hour, you should then choose fluid carbs before and during the activity. So here is an example of an Ironman triathlon. This is Andreas. And if you're an Ironman triathlete, you have to transport all the carbs you need during this triathlon by yourself. So usually it takes you about 100 portions, meaning 1,000 grams of carbs during an Ironman triathlon. And that has nothing to do with diabetes. Also, non-diabetic triathletes need this huge amount of additional carbs. The problem is, how can you transport this huge amount of carbs while exercising? And there is a powder, it's called maltodextrine. I hope I pronounced it right. So it's a powder, it's doesn't taste sweet, so it's it has a neutral taste, and you can easily add a lot of carbs in little space. If you look on the bike, you see there are 2 bottles with Andreas. And the bottle in the back, there he stores about 100 portions, 1,000 grams of carbs with this maltodextrin powder. And this is also a very, very good solution if you go hiking and you want to transport a lot of carbs with little weight. So time of the day is also a very important factor. You all know this when you're thinking about your insulin amount for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know that your insulin sensitivity varies throughout the time of the day. And the same thing is for the insulin sensitivity. So there are times where you are more sensitive to insulin and other times of the day where you're less sensitive to insulin. And therefore, you have to make different adaptations depending on your insulin sensitivity, varying throughout the day. So Steffi, she is spinning. She's a spinning instructor, and she has 5 or 7 different basal rates where she adjusts her different physical activities. One day she's an early bird. This is her early bird basal rate. I don't know. It's the purple one. If you see it between 2 and 4, there is very little insulin. So this early bird basal rate means that Steffi gets up at 4 o'clock and does her spinning training from 4 to 6 in the morning. She does not want to set her alarm clock at 2 o'clock to do a temporarily basal rate reduction. So she already programmed an alternative basal rate, which automatically reduces the amount of basal rate delivering by 80%. So only 20% of her basal rate is delivered between 2 and 4. So when she gets up, she usually has a rising glucose trend and an elevated glucose level, also a reduced basal rate, and she can do her spinning training safely. And because she's an instructor, she has different classes throughout the week. And so depending on these classes, she set different basal rates for every day in her pump. So the training conditions is also a very important factor. And as you can see, Robert Lewandowski, the most famous soccer player in the world, he not only has more activity-related muscle mass, as you can obviously see, but due to that obvious factor, the glycogen stores are much bigger because the glycogen uptake of the muscles can also be trained. And one more very important factor is trained athletes work more economically, and by that they need less energy. And here you can see an example. Diana, she continuously improved her training condition in running. She wrote an article here in the book, and it described her as a couch potato, and she was stating herself as I'm obviously too lazy to run. So when she started her running career in 2012, she needed 20 grams additional carbs every 10 minutes. And she was reducing her basal rate down to 20%. Also, she reduced it by 80% 3 hours before she started running. And the running was about 1 minute running, 1 minute walking, 1 minute running, 1 minute more, 1 minute walking. She was doing that for 10 to 15 minutes. And therefore she had this huge need of additional carbs and the huge need of reducing her insulin. After a couple of years, when she became the trained runner, she only had to reduce her basal rate about an hour before the activity, and she only had to take up 10 additional grams of carbs every 20 minutes. So when you think about your therapy adjustments and you finally think, yes, now I'm fine. Now I managed to set my perfect insulin dose reductions, and I exactly know how much extra carbs I need. And your training condition varies because you had some sick days and you couldn't train, or you were off season and had some vacation or so. It might start all over again. So the most important factor is the glucose level and the glucose trend before, during, and after exercise. So the glucose trend should be rising before the start of the exercise, and it should be constant during exercise, because then your performance is at the best. And so Monique, she was one of the cyclists on the Race Across America team, which the team was winning. The team depends on 8 type 1 diabetics, and they were all using an insulin pump and a CGM system. And that was in 2007 to show that diabetics, if they use CGM in combination with a pump, they can do whatever they want in their exercise and there are no limits. And Monique said this wonderful sentence: it is a fact that with this CGM therapy, I had for the first time in my life the feeling that I'm taking part in this competition as an athlete, not as a diabetic. Just a short glimpse on the CGM trend and level, and otherwise I was able to focus fully on the race and not on my diabetes. And I think all of you can say this by yourselves, that exercising with a CGM system is like exercising with a guardian angel running with you and giving you always a warning right in time before you get a hypo to do some actions. If you set your CGM exercise profile right, that means your alarm for low glucose has to be raised. If usually your alarm is set at 4, you should raise your low glucose alarm up to the highest possible level, maybe up to 6.7. And you also should raise or deactivate your high glucose alarm. Your change rate for falling glucose should be set to the highest possible sensitivity, for example, 0.11 millimoles or highest sensitivity, and the change rate for rising glucose should be set to should be deactivated or should be set to the least possible sensitivity. As an example, you can see here with Kerstin, she is an inline skating athlete, and she follows her glucose trend and glucose levels on her smartwatch while doing skating competitions and training. And she knows 30 minutes before the end of her training when her glucose level is 9 and her glucose trend is constant or rising, she knows she can finish her training without needing additional carbs. When she notices at the same glucose level with 9, if she has a falling glucose trend, she knows that she has to drink fluid carbs right away to be able to finish her training session or her competition, safely avoiding hypoglycemia. So the aim is, depending on the actual glucose trend, you have to adapt the required amount of extra carbs. So the trend is the more important factor than the actual height of your glucose level. And I guess you all know that when you're using an insulin pump, an insulin pump therapy is much more flexible and much more advantage compared to multiple injection therapy, because you have less insulin on board while exercising, because you can reduce the basal rate easily 1 to 2 hours before the start of the activity by 30 to 80%. And this is what a healthy pancreas is doing. So think like a pancreas, but don't stop the pump at all or take it off. Think of the risk of ketoacidosis. So by this, you're much more flexible because you need less time for all these adjustments, and you have a low risk for getting a hypo during the activity. And I don't know if you can see this here with this infusion set. There is the red thing is blood flowing back in the infusion set, because if you reduce your basal rate, the pressure coming from the pump going into the subcutaneous fat tissue is reduced by the reduction of the basal rate. On the other hand, the blood flow in the tissue is increased due to the increased activity. So by these factors, there is a very high risk of blood or Katharina, Gewebeflüssigkeit?
Interstitial fluid.
Thank you. Interstitial fluid is much higher. The blood you see, the interstitial fluid you do not see because it's clear like the insulin. So when you're doing vigorous exercise, you should change the infusion set after exercising. So what does that mean for insulin pump users using pumps who have a low suspend function. That means when you're using the Medtronic 640G or the T-Slim with the basal IQ, you should reduce the basal rate 1 to 2 hours before starting the activity. You have to increase the hypoglycemia shutoff level, meaning if you usually have the shutoff level by 3, you have to increase it up to the highest possible level, meaning 4.8. And you should start with elevated glucose levels, 7.5 to 10, and a rising glucose trend. If you are using the 670G or 77G and you plan very intense physical activity, you should deactivate the auto mode about 2 hours prior to the exercise, and then do the same precautions like you did with the 640G, meaning reducing the basal rate 1 to 2 hours before the start of the activity, increase the hypoglycemia shutoff, and start with higher glucose level and a rising glucose trend. When you use the T-Slim with the control IQ, you have much more possibilities to adjust your therapy when exercising. And you can do so by setting a special exercise profile. So you see here your weekday profile. The first part is the basal rate. And this basal rate, which here you have 0.75 units per hour, you can reduce this basal rate by 50 to 80%. So reducing it to 0.3 units per hour. You elevate the correction factor. So if 1 unit lowers the glucose by 2 millimoles, you increase that to 1 unit lowers your glucose by 5 to 6 millimoles. You reduce the insulin to carb ratio. So if you have 1 unit per 10 grams of carbs, you now reduce this to 1 unit for 30 or 40 grams to carbs. You elevate your target glucose from about 6 to 8 or 10 millimoles, and you prolong your insulin duration from 5 hours to 6 to 8 hours. So with the control IQ, with a special exercise profile, you can individualize your therapy adjustments while using the control IQ loop very good on an individual basis, almost as good as using a DIY RED system. And Katerina, Andreas, and I, we did a paper about safe and successfully completion of a half marathon using a DIY open source system. And Andreas, I showed you Andreas beforehand, is an Ironman triathlete now using Android APS system, and he developed some special exercise profiles to do safely looping also over with high intensity and long endurance. The last point is the muscle refilling effect, and that means after exercising, the glycogen stores of your liver and of your muscles are empty, and they have to be refilled. For refilling, they draw the glucose from your blood back into the cells, and therefore the glucose level will be dropping 12 to 36 hours after finishing the exercise, meaning after exercise is before exercise, referring to your therapy adjustments. So that means after exercising, use your CGM with an exercise profile, elevate the hypoglycemia shut-off level, and your low glucose alarm level, reduce the amount of insulin after exercise. That means all on the same basal and bolus insulin amounts, and consume additional carbs. If you want to lose weight, you should reduce the insulin more. If you are more competitive athlete or a professional athlete, and you want to maybe build up your muscles and your training level, you then need to increase your carbs more and you reduce the insulin less. So choose the option which is most suitable for you. There are some weird or common causes for glucose elevations after exercising, and the cause can be that the solid carbs you have been consuming before or during exercise are still in your stomach and have not been digested due to the slow digestion depending on the low blood supply. The previous basal rate reduction was too long and leads to insulin deficiency after the training. To avoid this, you might stop the glucose, the basal rate reduction, maybe half an hour or 45 minutes before finishing the exercise. The energy supply due to fat metabolism is still ongoing. This is often a factor after high intensity training. And to avoid this, you should, after high intensity training, add endurance exercise on a very low level of intensity. So do just like if you're in the gym and you did some HIIT training, then go on a treadmill or a stepper or an exercise bike with very less intensity, and do 10 to 15 minutes cool down training. And if you forgot to change your infusion set after exercising, that could also lead to increasing glucose levels after exercise. One last point is how to transport all these things while exercising. I don't know, you all know these special exercising belts, for example, from Nathan, or there is, I don't know if you know Anna. Anna is a type 1 diabetic herself, and she developed exercise clothes with pockets inside. So you find all these special exercise stuff on her homepage. Anna PS stands for Anna's Pump Stuff. And I use these clothes by myself, and they are very, very useful when exercising. Also, you have to protect your CGM receiver and your sensor and your insulin infusion set from getting off due to strong sweating. So therefore you have to take some kinesio tapes, some sport tapes to cover this. Or I know you in Canada have very strong winter, and a CGM transmitter is also freezing. So here a skiing athlete, he was doing his own protection. He was knitting something to put over his Dexcom, and he isolated it with some silver foil to keep the body warmth. And so when you're doing water sports, you have to protect your CGM from or your pump. You cannot go scuba diving with a pump due to the pressure. But if you want to go swimming, you have to protect your pump from getting wet. There is a special guy in Germany. He developed a special box where you can scan your glucose levels even when scuba diving in 30 or 40 meters depth. So this is, I'm a scuba diver myself, and this is so awesome. Just like if you're 40 meters below the sea, and you then can use this special tool. So who are we? The IDAA stands for International Diabetic Athletes Association. We were found in the States in 1987. I found the IDAA in Germany here in 1990. And so we're a team from athletes with a type 1 diabetes for athletes. And we have exercise activities all over Germany. We exchange our experiences and inform about diabetes and exercise, like I'm doing this today. And we support each other with tips and information. And we have a yearbook for our community, which comes, like the name says, once a year, where we write just like everything what's new, like this new scuba diving gear, or how to complete a marathon with the DIY loop system. And well, that was everything from my part. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent, very thorough overview. I'll turn it over to the panel to see who wants to start the question period. Thank you so much, Ulrike, for that wonderful talk. Sylvie would like to ask a question.
I'd like to know if the maltodextrin is the same thing as the Dex4.
Katharina, kannst du sie?
It's Dex4 tablets, glucose tablets.
No, definitely not. Maltodextrin is a special powder with a high glucose concentration. Katharina, Maltodextrine, die Übersetzung.
I think it's the same word. I'm not sure about the pronunciation, but I guess you call it maltodextrin.
And maltodextrin is not glucose, because maltodextrin has a higher concentration and it's developed for endurance athletes. So the concentration varies. If you look on the home pages of the different maltodextrin products, there will be different, you find different numbers.
Oh.
You have maltodextrin 19, 30, 30. So that means the concentration of short acting glucose and longer acting glucose.
Oh.
And it's a very high concentration. So I'm doing just like in a small bottle like this. So like you see, this bottle is not only my hand, I can transport about 250 grams of carbs. So when I'm doing a marathon or a half marathon, I can transport with very little weight, very much glucose.
Okay, you put that in water, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
I put it in water, or I put it in apple juice,
Okay.
whatever taste you prefer.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question about that. The maltodextrin. Did you say it was flavorless?
Yes, it is flavorless.
Okay.
So
I'm going to check that out. That's
Yeah.
I've never heard of that, so that's really interesting.
it's really awesome because when you have to do some long endurance things, there are some, I don't know, Joel, what kind of exercise are you doing?
Well, funny you ask. So about 5 weeks ago, I started long distance running, focused 100% on that. So about 20 to 30 miles a week at this point.
Beautiful. So if you, for example, do a marathon, latest at mile 20, you hate everything what tastes sweet. Because for the rest of the 20 miles, you stuff these sweet things into you. And so with the maltodextrin, you don't have this extreme sweet taste in your mouth all the time. And you don't have to consume so much fluid. I mean, you need a lot of fluid, but especially, let's say, on the marathon, on the last 6 miles, when all your glycogen stores are totally empty, you need much more glycogen uptake from outside because you cannot get any internal supplies, and therefore then it's very convenient if you don't have to take up such a huge amount of glucose tablets.
Okay. That's excellent. Thanks for sharing that. An excellent presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
It's full of information. I really enjoyed it.
I put a few links up where you can get maltodextrin in Canada.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was trying to find some good literature on it, but I supported someone not living with type 1 diabetes who did RAM in 1999, solo race. So he did 5,000 on the bike in 10 days. And that's what they recommended for him. Was a flavorless multidextrin, which we couldn't get our hands on back then, but he ended up eating a lot of chips and a lot of fat. And all of the plans that we had went right out the window.
This is also something you can do, but very important is you have to test everything which you want to do in the competition in a training beforehand, because I will never forget. I was doing the New York City Marathon in 2012 when it was canceled due to the storm. And that means we did the marathon all by ourselves because there was no official marathon. So we all ran the historic marathon in the Central Park, but there was no official supply. And so then the New Yorkers are very special. because the Halloween parties were all canceled either. The New Yorkers came with all their Halloween sweets, supplying them to the marathon runners. And so after a while, my own glucose supplies were limited. I took some of these gels, some Halloween gels, and they tasted, it was so gross. It was just this gel fluid, and I just had to give it back to Central Park right away, which did not help increasing my blood glucose. So make sure that whatever you plan to take in competition, you test beforehand in your training.
I totally agree with that. Any other questions?
I was just going to say, I really enjoyed your presentation. This is
Thanks.
way above my level of exercising, but I know I've always run into different issues, and I'm still fairly, well, I've only been on the pump for a year, and at times I run into a bit of issues and stuff like this, even though I've got a little bit of adjustment. There's a lot more that I have to, a lot more work I have to do with it, because I guess the body changes as you're getting older and everything else. And this whole thing with COVID, everything's just kind of all over the place at times. So it's,
Yeah, but Patricia, so make sure what's this is why I was also saying every activity in your daily life, like gardening, shopping, sightseeing, it takes up the same glucose amount while running. And so for a trained Ironman triathlete doing whatever a 5 or 10K run is like whatever for totally nothing, which is for us high intensity exercise. I will never forget Timur. I showed you in the pictures the hockey guy. He will be in the Olympics this year for the German hockey team. He joined us in our soccer group, and in this soccer team we are playing about the German government. So this is a very whenever in your life do you have the opportunity to kick a member of the government against the leg without being punished? So this is to raise charity and awareness for diabetes. And so Timur played along and helped us in our team. And so we did a tournament, and we had 3 matches a day. And after that, I felt like dying. And then when he said, when we were finished, he said, "Okay, is it fine when I leave? Because I have to do my training now." And we all looked at him just like totally devastated, because we almost couldn't crawl anymore. And he said, "Okay, have a nice day. I have to do some serious training now." So this is everyone has to start somewhere and somehow, and there is no good or bad or little or high intensity training. You just have to consider which is your training condition and how to adjust with what kind of exercise. So all these therapy adjustments are very necessary for every level of activity.
Thank you.
Just maybe one question before we go, because we're a little over time.
Yeah.
Sylvie?
Oh, sorry. Vas-y, John. Vas-y.
I was just wondering, has anyone tried different types of CGMs for sports and noticed differences in terms of the performance of the CGM during intense activity? And recommendations for a type of CGM for the more competitive sport?
I tested them all, except I did not test the Eversense. I tested Medtronic, Dexcom, and Abbott. And so for me, they're all working fine, even during marathon running. I would, for scuba diving, I would do a recommendation to the Abbott Freestyle Libre, because the scanning case, which was developed, only works with the Abbott system. So whenever there is a scuba diver with you, then I would recommend the Abbott Freestyle Libre. For all the other physical activities, I would personally give the advice to test them and find out which suits to you individually the best.
Okay, and I think Joel was going to respond to that as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it was. This was good to hear. Definitely good to hear you've tried them all. In Canada, we might have possibly limited CGMs in comparison to what you have access to, but just my own experience, I've tried out the Libre 1, so and then compared it to the Dexcom G5 as well as G6. For long distance running, personal opinion, no comparison to Dexcom is a superior design, but again, we got to keep in mind, my opinion is based on, let's say, the G6 versus the Libre 1. So I've done a little research. I guess the Libre 2 is more accurate than the Libre 1, but still slightly less accurate. The MARD is slightly worse than the G6. So I've also so stats on paper is one thing, but then also personal experience, comparing to finger sticks, I would vouch for the Dexcom, and I continue to use the Libre.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And with that, Sylvie, une autre question?
Can we have your book in Canada?
Yes, but it's only in German.
Oh, okay. It's not for me.
the whole book is totally in German. But one thing before we end, I have to say a big thank you to Jonathan. He's a friend, and he helped me with the slides. And he did correct some spelling mistakes. So this is what I wanted to say before we end for the presentation. He put a lot of work in it to make the Canadian grammar right. He's a Canadian himself.
Excellent. Well, we'll have to thank Jonathan. Katarina's in the dark now. I think it's time to let our friends from across the pond go and enjoy their evening. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup à tout le monde, and we'll stay in touch. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.